What would you do if a stray dog kept following you through the dark streets of New Orleans? Would you ignore it, or would you check why it refused to leave? Detective Ryan Carter's instincts led him to a chilling discovery. A desperate note. A starving child and a newborn clinging to life. But who abandoned them? And who was the dangerous man trying to take them back? Find out in today's gripping story on TH, Voices of the Underdog. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The humid night air of New Orleans clung to Detective Ryan Carter as he walked across the nearly deserted police department parking lot. His shift had stretched on longer than expected, bogged down by tedious paperwork, frustrating dead-end cases, and a couple of routine disturbances that required minimal intervention but maximum patience. As he reached his car, he let out a deep breath, running a hand through his short-cropped brown hair. He was exhausted, craving nothing more than a hot shower and a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. But just as he reached for his car door, something made him pause. A sound, soft and subtle, like the faint rustling of fabric or the quiet scraping of nails against pavement. Ryan turned, his sharp detective instincts instantly on high alert. A small dog, covered in mud and grime, stood a few feet away, staring at him. Its thin body quivered slightly, as though it had been through hell. The matted fur clung to its frame, revealing the outline of ribs beneath. But what caught Ryan's attention most wasn't the state of the dog. It was the look in its eyes. Dogs shouldn't look desperate. Not like this. The animal took a cautious step forward, its tail tucked between its legs, its wide eyes locked onto Ryan's. He sighed. Stray dogs weren't uncommon in this part of the city, especially at night. But something about this one felt different. "You lost, buddy?" Ryan muttered, keeping his voice low and calm. The dog whined softly, taking another step closer. Ryan crouched down slightly, extending his hand in a slow, non-threatening movement. The dog flinched but didn't run. Instead, it hesitated, as if debating whether to trust him. Then, with a trembling motion, it inched forward, allowing Ryan to graze his fingers against its damp fur. That's when he felt it. Something rough, beneath the tangled hair. A collar. Ryan's brows furrowed. Most stray dogs didn't have collars. That meant someone had owned this dog once. Maybe they still did. But what really sent a chill down his spine was what was tucked inside the collar. His fingers brushed against something thin and crumpled, hidden between the fabric. Frowning, he carefully pulled it out. It was a note. A small, damp, wrinkled scrap of paper. Ryan's stomach twisted as he unfolded it carefully, smoothing the edges against his palm. The faint glow of the street lamp overhead barely illuminated the shaky, uneven handwriting, written in what appeared to be a child's desperate scrawl. "My little brother is very weak. No food, no water. Please help. Apartment 206. Ryan's pulse spiked. He read the note again, his grip tightening around the paper. The exhaustion that had weighed on him seconds ago vanished in an instant. Someone, a child, was in trouble, and this dog had come to find help. Ryan exhaled slowly, his mind already shifting into cop mode. The implications of the note sent his thoughts racing. How long had the child been without food or water? How young was the brother? Why hadn't anyone called 911? A wave of unease settled over him. There were far too many possibilities, and none of them were good. He glanced down at the dog, which had now settled into a sitting position at his feet, staring up at him with wide, waiting eyes. Ryan clenched his jaw. This dog came to me for a reason. The logical part of his brain told him to call dispatch, request backup, and wait for the proper authorities to handle it. But his gut, his instinct honed from years on the force, told him that time was running out. He couldn't afford to wait. He looked down at the dog again, his voice low but firm. "All right, buddy," he murmured. "Lead the way." The dog's ears perked up, and then it moved. With sudden determination, it turned and trotted down the darkened street, glancing back every few seconds as if ensuring Ryan was following. Ryan took a deep breath and quickened his pace. The city at night was a different world. During the day, New Orleans was alive, filled with jazz, laughter, the rich aroma of Creole cuisine, and the constant hum of tourists wandering the French Quarter. But at this hour, especially in the wrong neighborhoods, it became a ghost town. The dog led Ryan down a maze of dimly lit streets, past abandoned storefronts, flickering neon signs, and crumbling brick buildings. The pavement was cracked, and the distant sound of a siren echoed in the background. Ryan stayed vigilant, his hand near his holster. This wasn't a part of town he'd wander into unarmed. The dog kept a steady pace, weaving through alleyways, and cutting across empty roads with uncanny precision. It was as if it knew exactly where it was going. Finally, after several minutes of navigating the eerily silent streets, the dog led Ryan to a rundown apartment complex. Ryan stopped a few feet from the entrance, scanning the building. It was in bad shape. The paint peeled from the walls, exposing the brick beneath. The windows were either boarded up or broken. The neon vacancy sign at the entrance buzzed intermittently, casting an eerie green glow over the cracked sidewalk. Ryan felt his stomach tighten. He knew this place. The neighborhood was notorious for drug deals, gang violence, and missing persons cases that rarely had happy endings. His instincts screamed danger. He took a step closer. The dog let out a small whimper, then bounded up the rickety stairs leading to the second floor. Ryan followed. His boots echoed against the metal steps as he climbed, his heart pounding with anticipation. Apartment 206. Ryan stopped in front of the faded wooden door, paint chipping away near the bottom. He knocked once, no answer. He knocked again, harder. Still, nothing. Behind the door, the silence felt wrong, too heavy, too lifeless. Ryan's gut twisted. The dog scratched at the base of the door, whimpering urgently. Something was very, very wrong. Ryan reached for his gun, then he took a step back, braced himself, and slammed his shoulder into the door. The wood splintered under the force, the lock snapping instantly. The door swung open into darkness, and the smell that hit him made his blood run cold. The air inside the apartment complex was thick with an oppressive stillness. Detective Ryan Carter had seen his fair share of crime scenes, places of neglect, and homes abandoned in despair. But something about this place felt different. He stood in front of apartment 206, staring at the chipped door, the paint peeling away in jagged strips, revealing the warped wood beneath. The brass numbers on the door were rusted and barely clinging to the frame. The dog that had led him here was whimpering now, scratching feverishly at the base of the door, its small body tense with urgency. Ryan knocked firmly, his knuckles rapping sharply against the hollow-sounding door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Nothing. But behind the silence, something felt wrong. The kind of wrong that sent a chill down a cop's spine. The kind of wrong that told him if he didn't act now, he might be too late. The dog let out a low, anxious whine, pawing at the door with renewed desperation. Ryan's jaw clenched. He didn't have time to wait. Bracing himself, he took a step back, lifted his foot, and kicked just below the handle with controlled force. The door splintered on impact, the rusted lock giving way almost instantly. With a loud crack, the door swung inward, slamming against the adjacent wall. And then the smell hit him. It was overwhelming, a suffocating mix of stale air, spoiled food, and something far worse. The kind of scent that told a story before you even stepped inside. A story of neglect, of things left to rot, of desperation steeped into the very walls. Ryan instinctively lifted his arm, covering his nose with the sleeve of his jacket. He had smelled death before. And while this wasn't the putrid stench of decay, it carried the same kind of heaviness. His eyes adjusted to the dimness inside. The room was barely lit, only the faint glow of a flickering street lamp seeping in through a torn curtain. Shadows stretched across the floor, revealing the sparse, nearly empty living space. His gaze swept the room, taking in the details with practiced efficiency. The walls were stained, covered in peeling wallpaper. The floor was littered with discarded food wrappers, crumpled napkins, and empty bottles. The couch in the corner was overturned, its stuffing spilling out through a large rip. The refrigerator door hung slightly ajar, revealing only darkness inside, except for a single carton of milk, long since expired. And then he saw them. Huddled in the farthest corner of the room, half hidden by the shadows, a frail boy sat curled against the wall, clutching something tightly in his arms. Ryan's breath caught. The boy couldn't have been more than 9 years old, his small frame swallowed by an oversized hoodie that hung loosely around his thin shoulders. His face was pale, hollow-cheeked, and his lips were dry and cracked. But what truly made Ryan's heart stop was what the boy was holding. A baby. Swaddled in a filthy, tattered blanket, the infant lay frighteningly still in the boy's protective grasp. For a second, Ryan couldn't move. His training screamed at him to assess, react, control the situation. But for a fraction of a second, he was just a man staring at a reality too horrifying to comprehend. Then, the baby stirred, a weak, almost imperceptible rise and fall of its tiny chest. Ryan's paralysis broke. He took a slow step forward, his voice steady but low, keeping his movements calculated so he wouldn't scare the boy. "Hey, kid," he said gently. "My name's Ryan. I'm here to help." The boy, Elijah, Ryan would later learn, flinched violently, his arms tightening protectively around the baby, as if Ryan was about to rip them apart. His wide, terrified eyes locked onto Ryan's like a cornered animal, his entire body trembling. Ryan stopped in his tracks. This boy wasn't just scared, he was terrified, not just of Ryan, of everything, of losing what little he had left. Ryan swallowed hard. How long had they been alone like this? "It's okay," he said, keeping his tone calm, soothing. "I promise, I'm not here to hurt you." Elijah didn't respond, his arms tightening around the baby so much that Ryan worried he'd accidentally hurt him. Ryan crouched slightly, trying to make himself seem less intimidating. "What's your name, buddy?" Still nothing, only silent, shuddering breaths. Ryan's gaze flickered to the baby, noting the shallow, labored rise and fall of its tiny chest. There was no more time. Ryan made a decision. Slowly, carefully, he reached out. The moment his hand brushed against the edge of the blanket, Elijah let out a small, choked sound, a noise halfway between a sob and a protest. But Ryan didn't pull back. "I need to help him," he said softly. "Your brother. He's not doing too good, kid. I need to get him to a doctor, okay?" For a long, agonizing second, Elijah didn't move. Then, with the smallest, most reluctant nod, he loosened his grip. That was all Ryan needed. He scooped the baby into his arms, his breath catching at how light he was, far too light, malnourished, dehydrated, dying. Ryan stood up fast, his pulse hammering. "We have to go, now." The dog bolted ahead as if leading the charge. Elijah hesitated, lingering at the threshold of the doorway, his body tense with uncertainty. Ryan turned back, holding the baby close to his chest. "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly. Elijah's wide, fearful eyes met his. Then, with a shaky breath, the boy took a step forward. That was all Ryan needed. He grabbed Elijah's small hand, holding it tightly as they ran, down the stairs, through the halls. Out into the night, Ryan didn't stop until he reached the curb, pulling out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Detective Carter. I need an ambulance at 14th and Magnolia. 2 children, severe malnutrition and dehydration. The infant is unresponsive. I need immediate medical assistance." His voice was rock solid, but inside, his heart was pounding. He tightened his grip around the baby, pressing him closer to his chest, feeling the weak warmth against his shirt. And then, a sound. Faint, barely there, but real. The baby let out a tiny, shaky breath against Ryan's skin. Ryan closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over him like a tide. The baby was still fighting, and so was Ryan. Because this fight, it was only just beginning. The steady beeping of monitors filled the quiet hospital room, accompanied only by the distant murmur of nurses moving through the hallways. Detective Ryan Carter sat in a stiff plastic chair, his forearms resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the frail boy sitting opposite him. Elijah had barely moved since they arrived. He sat hunched in the oversized hospital chair, his small hands clenched into tight fists in his lap. The hospital had provided him with fresh clothes, sweatpants that sagged at his hips and a loose sweatshirt that hung from his shoulders like it belonged to someone twice his size. But Elijah wasn't concerned about his own comfort. His gaze never left the hospital crib where Gabriel lay, his tiny chest rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. The baby was hooked up to an IV, his skin still frighteningly pale. But at least he was warm now. At least he was safe. Ryan had seen kids in tough situations before, but something about Elijah's silence made his stomach twist. The boy hadn't said a single word since they arrived. Not when the doctors checked him over. Not when they asked him how long he had gone without food. Not when they tried to explain that Gabriel needed fluids and close monitoring. He had just nodded when necessary, his wide dark eyes tracking every movement, every person that came near his brother, as if afraid that at any moment someone might take him away. Ryan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to something calm, something steady. "Hey, kid, you holding up?" Elijah didn't respond. Ryan exhaled through his nose. He had dealt with closed-off witnesses before, but this was different. This wasn't just fear. This was a child who had learned that trusting adults was dangerous. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, thinking. If there was one thing he knew, kids, like Elijah, didn't respond well to pressure. So instead of pushing, he waited. Minutes stretched on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elijah moved. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift, his fingers unclenching slightly from his lap. And then, his lips parted. "They left us," he whispered. Ryan stilled. "Who did, Elijah?" he asked softly. The boy swallowed hard, his hands gripping the hospital, blanket draped over his lap. His voice was barely audible, but it was raw, heavy with the weight of something no child should ever have to say. "Mom and Dad." Ryan felt his chest tighten. Elijah hesitated, then slowly turned his head toward Ryan, his expression eerily blank, too empty for a child his age. "3 weeks ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They said they had to go, that they'd be back soon. They told me to take care of Gabriel until then." Ryan's jaw clenched. "Did they say where they were going?" Elijah shook his head. "No, just that they had to leave." Ryan exhaled sharply, trying to keep his emotions in check. He had seen neglect, abandonment, abuse. But something about this felt even colder. "Did they leave you anything?" he asked, forcing his voice to stay neutral. Elijah nodded. His hands reached into the pocket of the sweatshirt the hospital had given him. From inside, he pulled out a folded scrap of paper, smoothing it flat against his lap. Ryan leaned forward slightly to get a better look. The note was short. "Stay strong. We'll be back soon. Take care of Gabriel." That was it. No explanation. No instructions. Just a handful of empty words and a lifetime of consequences. Ryan clenched his fists. His hands itched to crush the paper, to tear it apart, to find the people who had done this and make them understand just how cruel they had been. But he didn't, because right now, his anger didn't matter. What mattered was the boy sitting across from him, his small fingers still clutching that pathetic excuse of a goodbye letter like it was the last thread holding his world together. Ryan took a slow breath, forcing himself to unclench his fists. "Elijah, did you know they weren't coming back?" The boy didn't answer right away. Then, a tiny nod. Ryan swallowed hard. Of course he had known. He had known the moment the food ran out. He had known when the water stopped running. He had known when the days stretched into nights and the silence of an empty apartment became deafening. But still, he had stayed. He had waited. Because what else could a 9-year-old do? Ryan sat back, exhaling through his nose. "You don't have to wait anymore, kid," he said, his voice softer now. "I promise. You're not alone in this." For the first time, Elijah's eyes flickered with something hesitant. Like he wanted to believe Ryan, but didn't know if he could. Ryan was about to say more when he caught movement outside the glass window of the hospital room. A tall man stood near the nurse's station. Ryan's instincts flared. The man was dressed in dark clothing, a hood pulled up over his head. His posture was casual, but too casual. He wasn't lost. He wasn't a concerned relative. He was looking for something, or someone. Ryan tensed. A nurse approached the man, likely asking if he needed help. The man leaned in slightly, murmuring something low. The nurse nodded, then gestured toward Elijah's hospital room. Ryan's blood turned to ice. The man was looking for Elijah. Ryan's muscles coiled, his entire body shifting into protective mode. He turned to Elijah, his voice calm but firm. "Do you know that man?" Elijah looked over, his face instantly paling. His small fingers clutched the hospital blanket so tightly his knuckles turned white. I don't know," he whispered. But his reaction said otherwise. He was scared. Ryan stood up smoothly, his movements controlled but deliberate. "Stay here," he said quietly. Elijah nodded quickly, shrinking into the chair. Ryan stepped toward the hospital door, just as the man took a step closer. The moment their eyes met, Ryan knew. This man was dangerous, and he was here for the boy. Ryan's body went rigid as the stranger took another step toward the hospital room. From the moment their eyes met, Ryan knew this man was dangerous. Not in the obvious violent way, but in the calculated, something isn't right way. His movements were too controlled, his posture too rehearsed. The man stood just outside the doorway now, glancing at Elijah before turning his gaze back to Ryan. "I'm here for the boy," he said, his voice smooth but hollow. Ryan didn't move. "And you are?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral, his stance casual. But his body was already positioned between the man and Elijah. The stranger tilted his head slightly, studying Ryan before offering a practiced smile. "Name's Mark, family friend. I've been looking for these kids." Ryan didn't believe him for a second. He let the silence stretch, watching the man, waiting. People like him, Liars, manipulators, predators. They hated silence. They thrived on control, on shifting narratives. Sure enough, after a few tense beats, Mark exhaled dramatically, as if annoyed by the formality of it all. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, as if sharing a secret. "Their parents, they left them in my care, all right? I just found out they were here and came to get them. We don't need any trouble." Ryan felt his fingers twitch toward his gun. "You got any paperwork to back that up?" he asked, still calm, still controlled. Mark's jaw tightened slightly. "No, but—" Ryan cut him off before he could finish. "Then you're not taking them anywhere." The shift in Mark's demeanor was instantaneous. The fake friendliness evaporated, replaced by something sharper, colder. "Listen, Detective," Mark said, voice now edged with irritation. "You don't know what's going on here. These kids aren't your problem." Ryan's blood boiled at the phrase. "That's where you're wrong," he said coolly. Mark's eyes darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. Ryan knew that look. It was the look of a man realizing he wasn't going to get what he wanted, at least not easily. And that made him dangerous. Ryan's hand hovered just above his holstered gun, a silent warning. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice deadly calm. "You're going to turn around and walk out of this hospital, right now. Or I'm calling security, and after that, Child Protective Services." Mark's nostrils flared. For a moment, Ryan thought he might push his luck, might try something stupid. But then, he exhaled sharply and stepped back. "You're making a mistake," Mark muttered, shaking his head. Ryan didn't blink. "Get out." Mark hesitated, just for a second. Then with a final glare, he turned on his heel and stalked down the hall. Ryan waited until he disappeared from sight before pulling out his phone. "Security, I need an immediate watch placed on room 417. We might have a custody threat." The response was quick. Within minutes, hospital security arrived. Ryan made sure they had Elijah and Gabriel moved to a more secure wing of the hospital, where only authorized personnel could enter. Ryan watched from the doorway as Elijah curled up in the hospital bed beside Gabriel, his small body still tense from the encounter. Ryan hated that. Hated that this kid, this 9-year-old kid, had learned to brace himself for the worst. "You're safe," Ryan said, his voice quieter now. Elijah didn't say anything, but after a long moment, he nodded. And Ryan knew that was the most trust he had given anyone in a very, very long time. That night, Ryan sat alone in his apartment. A single dim light illuminating the mess of paperwork spread across his small kitchen table. He had spent years compartmentalizing emotions, separating his cases from his personal life, building a clear, unbreakable wall between the two. But tonight, that wall felt like it was cracking. He rubbed his hands over his face, exhaling slowly. Could he really walk away from these kids? It wasn't just about rescuing them from a bad situation. It was about what came next. Elijah and Gabriel had no one, no family, no home, no safe place to return to. And Ryan knew how the system worked. He had seen too many kids get shuffled through foster care, ending up with people who didn't care about them. He thought about the way Elijah flinched at sudden movements, the way he kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. He thought about how Gabriel had barely had the strength to cry, how his little body had felt weightless in Ryan's arms. And then he made a decision. Not as a cop, not out of obligation, but as a man who knew, deep down, that these kids deserved more. By morning, he had made the call. The paperwork was already in motion. Ryan Carter wasn't just going to protect them. He was going to keep them. Later that day, Ryan sat across from Elijah, sliding a thick envelope across the hospital table. "What's this?" the boy asked, hesitant. Ryan leaned forward. It's up to you, Elijah. But if you and Gabriel want, you don't have to go anywhere else. You can stay with me. Elijah stared at him, not with excitement, not with immediate joy, but with pure disbelief, like the words didn't make sense, like they weren't meant for him. His small hands hovered over the envelope, hesitant, as if touching it might make it disappear. You really want to keep us? He asked, voice barely a whisper. Ryan didn't hesitate. More than anything. Elijah blinked rapidly, his small fingers clutching the papers now, gripping them as if they were a lifeline. For the first time, his eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of fear. They weren't tears of pain. They were tears of relief. Elijah swallowed hard. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he nodded. And that was the beginning of everything. The air inside the New Orleans family court was still, thick with an unspoken weight that settled over the room. Sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, but it did little to warm the heavy atmosphere that lingered between the walls. Detective Ryan Carter sat at the long wooden table, his hands clasped together, his back straight, but his heart hammering against his ribs. To his right, Elijah sat stiffly, his small fingers curled into the fabric of his dress shirt, his legs barely reaching the floor from the courtroom chair. He was dressed in clothes that actually fit him now, but despite the newness of them, he still seemed to shrink inside them, as if he wasn't sure he belonged in a place like this. Ryan had seen the boy endure weeks of uncertainty, watching him grow in cautious trust, watching him begin to believe, little by little, that he was safe. But today was different, because today, everything would be decided. In Ryan's arms, Gabriel shifted slightly, wrapped snugly in a blanket. The baby had gained weight since the night Ryan had carried him out of that crumbling apartment. And though he was still small, his cheeks weren't sunken anymore. He was thriving. But none of it would matter. None of it would be permanent, until the judge gave his ruling. Ryan clenched his fists, trying to fight the weight pressing against his chest. He had never wanted anything as much as this. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp, discerning eyes, adjusted her glasses as she glanced down at the papers in front of her. The final step in the adoption process. Then she lifted her gaze to Elijah. Elijah, she said, her voice steady but kind. Do you understand why you're here today? Elijah nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. And do you understand what Detective Carter is asking? He would like to adopt you and your brother, making you a legal part of his family. Elijah shifted slightly in his chair. For a moment, Ryan feared the boy might freeze, that the weight of this moment was too much. But then, Elijah straightened, and when he spoke, his voice was clear, unwavering. Yes. The courtroom fell silent for a brief moment. The judge gave a small nod, as if she had expected nothing less. Then, with a soft smile, she turned to Ryan. Mr. Carter, do you vow to provide for these children? To protect them? To love them as your own? Ryan's throat tightened. With everything I have, he said, his voice steady. The judge glanced between them once more. Then she lifted the gavel and brought it down in a decisive tap. Then, it is my pleasure to declare this adoption finalized. Congratulations, Mr. Carter. You are now the legal father of Elijah and Gabriel. A breath Ryan hadn't realized he was holding rushed out of him. Beside him, Elijah sat perfectly still, as if the words hadn't fully settled yet. Then, slowly, his small hand reached out, gripping Ryan's sleeve. And Ryan knew, in that moment, that it was real for him now. They were a family. Later that night, the house felt different. It wasn't bigger. It wasn't cleaner, but it felt fuller. Charlie, the little dog who had started it all, was curled up on the living room rug, his tail wagging lazily as Elijah sat beside him, absently scratching behind his ears. Gabriel had been put to bed hours. Ego, his tiny chest rising and falling in the crib Ryan had put together with far more struggle than he'd like to admit. Now it was just the two of them, Ryan and Elijah, sitting in the soft glow of the table lamp, the adoption paperwork, still lying between them. "So," Ryan started, leaning back slightly. "You okay?" Elijah nodded, but Ryan could see the hesitation in his eyes. "It's okay if you're not," he added. Elijah hesitated for a moment before speaking. I don't know how to do this," he admitted, voice quiet. Ryan frowned slightly. "Do what?" Be part of a family." The words hit hard. Ryan had suspected that Elijah had been alone long before his parents left. But hearing him say it so plainly, it made Ryan's chest ache. Ryan exhaled. "Well, I don't think there's one right way to do it," he admitted. "But we'll figure it out. Together." Elijah looked up at him then, as if searching for any sign that Ryan didn't mean it. But Ryan meant every word. For the first time that night, Elijah smiled. Not big, not bright, but real. Later that night, as Ryan was about to leave Elijah's room, something stopped him. Elijah sat in bed, the covers pulled up around him, his small body barely making a dent in the mattress. He seemed comfortable, more at ease than Ryan had ever seen him. But just as Ryan reached the door, about to "Turn off the light," Elijah spoke. "Dad." Ryan froze. The word was soft, hesitant, as if Elijah wasn't sure if he should say it. Ryan turned, his heart swelling, tightening all at once. Elijah was staring at the ceiling, his fingers clenched into the fabric of his blanket, his expression unreadable. Ryan swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Yeah?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Good night." Ryan's chest felt like it might break open. He walked back to the bed, lowered himself down beside Elijah, and placed a steady, reassuring hand on the boy's head. "Good night, kiddo." And this time, Elijah didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just exhaled softly, his body finally relaxing. And Ryan knew. This wasn't just a moment. It wasn't just a word. It was a promise. A promise that Elijah and Gabriel would never be abandoned again. A promise that Ryan wasn't going anywhere. A promise that finally they were home.